Alright, what's going on guys? Dan Watson, and this is the new Autel Lite Plus. And I've actually been using this drone for the past few months. However, Autel has just thrown out a firmware update for this drone that might have just made it the best drone you can buy under $2,000. So let's take a look. So obviously you can't test out this drone without comparing it to DJI because they're pretty much the biggest player in the industry. And what's interesting is that this drone is kind of in between this Air 2S and the new Mavic 3 in almost every way, including the price. So if the Mavic 3 seems like it just might be a little out of your budget, or maybe you want something just a little bit more than what the Air 2S is giving you, this might be the perfect drone to get. Now the hardware on this drone is actually really good. I've been a fan of Autel for this reason, but this drone, typically on these cheaper drones, they'll kind of tone it down a little bit, use some cheaper, lighter plastics, but this is built extremely well. And then they have these carbon fiber frames on the legs, and I can't tell if it's real carbon fiber, but it definitely feels like it. So everything on this drone though is extremely rugged. Thankfully, I haven't crashed it yet, but it definitely feels like it would hold up way better in a crash to some of the more flimsy, lightweight plastic on some of the DJI drones. But what is obvious on this is that the battery is huge. This is actually a lot of the weight here. These are literally just about double the capacity of something like the Air 2S. So I think what Autel did is they basically created a very rugged drone, which made it heavier, and thus they needed a larger battery to keep it in the air. But more on battery life in a little bit, because that's actually really insane. You also have sensors all around the drone. So we have 2 on the front, 2 on the back, and then some underneath. We don't have any on the top though. It's not a big deal for me. One thing you will find is that there's nothing on the sides either. That's just like the Air 2S, so nothing really crazy for this price of drone. However, I do find that Autel's sensing system seems to work from even further away than some of the DJI drones and seems to be really effective, like almost too effective, alerting me and slowing down if the drone gets you anywhere close to something. Now you can get this drone in actually white or gray, but this orange color also makes it really easy to spot in the sky. So you might want to actually just get this orange version, even if you like some of the colors, just for that reason alone. So I'll be honest, I've actually had this drone for the past few months, but I've held off on making the full review because the photography aspects on this were great. But for video, I just wasn't 100% okay with a couple of features, and I knew there were probably some updates coming. One was that the tracking just didn't have the full capability I wanted from the drone. The other was going to be mainly with the color profiles on this. So the default color profile, especially for video, you don't see this in raw photos, but for video, it's very magenta heavy and definitely over sharpened a bit. And for this drone, they didn't have any kind of log option or ability to control that. So firmware updates have come through, tons of new features on them, but the big ones are going to be dynamic tracking of a human being or a person in the subject, HDR video, and log video. We'll talk about quality a bit more in a second, but once these updates really hit, I felt that this was finally a drone worthy of the price tag, but once I tested it out, it actually made for some really interesting results. Check this out, guys. This is a new scooter by Autel called the Neon. It's what I use in all those drone tracking shots, and it's some really cool new features on this thing. So if you're in the market for a scooter, definitely check this thing out. So the hardware in the scooter looks pretty simple, but has quite a few features going on here. My favorite is probably these LED strips in the front and the sides, because you can actually modify how these work in the app. Plus you have this full headlight control. So between both of those, this should help make it extremely safe to ride at night. There's also a really awesome suspension system that's somewhat covertly built into the rear deck, which is really helpful. It does have a full digital display, and you can access a bunch of speeds, modes, and even a locking mechanism inside the app. Now the scooter itself has a 250 watt motor and does 16 miles an hour with a range of almost 25 miles. It's also fully foldable with one click, so you can just carry it around or throw it in your trunk in just a matter of seconds. Now in the app itself, you have the ability to fully unlock the scooter, change your lighting to basically anything that you can dream of. And I do have a link and a coupon code in the description, so whether you're looking at this for transportation or just having a fun ride, or honestly when I'm not riding it, my kids are having a blast on this thing, so definitely go check it out. So let's get into the image quality of this. So photos on this look great, and I'd even say slightly more detailed than the DJI Air 2S. Definitely less distortion on the lens, but this is also helped by the fact that the DJI drone is a bit wider angle lens, so 88 degrees field of view compared to a bit more narrow on the Lite Plus at 82 degrees. I'm still torn on which one I prefer. I think for me, I'm usually shooting subjects like waterfalls or a car or a person or something like that. So having a little bit tighter usually helps with that. But there are definitely a few kind of expansive landscape shots I took down in Puerto Rico, and these maybe would have helped if I had a little bit wider lens. Now for video, things are completely different. So first of all of the Autel Lite Plus shots have way more detail in them than the DJI Air 2S. I've actually found this to be true in the older models as well. So much I actually wish the sharpness was turned down a bit because it is just more than I need and able to shoot full 6K. The colors though are tuned very magenta, and only in video mode. You don't see this color difference when shooting raw photos. Although I'm noticing that the greens are just a little bit more saturated on this Autel, which to be honest looks good. It usually makes it look better, but it's almost like Autel saw these greens were a bit rich and did a little bit of a magenta tint shift to compensate for them. But definitely if you're trying to match shots with other cameras, this drone is a little bit different look when shooting in that standard profile. Now, one thing I did struggle with a bit was the range, especially if it was behind like trees or waters, but even in line of sight. And I don't know why, I seem to have range issues a lot in the areas I shoot with, but this should be able to fly a few miles. I think Autel actually quotes 7 miles for this line of sight. But there were times I was losing signal at like 1,500 feet. So not sure what was up with that. And granted, I definitely have issues with DJI drones not going as far as they quote, but this one probably was a bit worse for me. Hopefully some of the new firmware helps iron that out a bit, but depending on your range, it could be a lot lower than you might expect. However, I am a huge fan of the app on this. So the drone actually points and shows you exactly where you are and where your home location is. So it's really easy to figure out kind of if you're going away or towards you and get headed back in the right direction. So when signal does come out, it's pretty easy to fly in the right direction and get things back in. Now this drone can actually send a 2.7K signal back to the phone, which is extremely high resolution. I think you need to be in 4K for that. I won't do it in 6K. However, I was finding that maybe a couple hundred feet out, that signal was starting to deteriorate a little bit. So for me, in the areas I was flying, I just wasn't seeing that super high-end, high-resolution signal coming back to my phone. Now, what was crazy impressive for me is the battery life. And this is probably the only drone that I felt I was exceeding my battery life expectations for this. So especially if you aren't doing a lot of like crazy sports mode flying, I was easily shooting for way over 30 minutes and still landing the drone with like 10 to 20% battery life. So huge plus when it comes to battery life on this one. Now, probably the biggest feature on the Lite Plus over the Air 2S is that you now have adjustable aperture, and there are a few awesome reasons to have this. So the first is that obviously you can have a little bit more depth of field for ensuring that everything that you're shooting is going to be in focus. You're going to be relying a little bit less on the autofocus system in this. However, more importantly is you have an additional way of controlling your exposure, and this is incredibly important for video, because even if you put an ND filter on your drone, you'll never be able to exactly dial in the exposure in the air and still keep that perfect 180 shutter speed, because the brightness is always changing when I'm in the air and you can't adjust the ND filter strength while it's in the air. So if you're a video shooter, this feature makes the Lite Plus a massive upgrade. However, from a usability standpoint, it's kind of annoying because the aperture doesn't change in real time. So you kind of have to change the aperture, wait a second or two for the exposure to change, check if that was enough, and then change it again. So for whatever reason, it's not completely real time. Again, not a massive issue. It just meant that it took a little bit longer for me to dial in my correct exposure. So unfortunately, the firmware update with these new features didn't quite do it for me. So the tracking, it's there, it's better, it's improved, but it is not amazing. It is still still not up to what DJI is doing, and it wasn't really all that reliable for me in the field, so I just don't use it all that much. The other big thing was log video. Unfortunately, it is here, but it only works in auto mode. If you go into the pro mode, you do not have any ability to use either the HDR or the log video profiles. And obviously I want to use those in the pro mode, not in the normal automatic mode. So I'm hoping that if Autel can deliver in the auto mode, they can also deliver in the pro mode. But as of now, neither one of these features are really usable in the real world. So for about $500 more than the Air 2S, it definitely feels like you're getting a better drone. I mean, it's more rugged, has better battery life, better image quality despite having the same size sensor, and it has that Made in America badge. The only real downside is that it felt a bit heavier and it's obviously more expensive. And since the DJI Mavic 3 is almost $1,000 more, the Lite Plus is really holding its own in that middle ground between those two. I'd still love to see some firmware updates address some of the range issues I was having on the drone. Should be capable of way more than I was getting, and I also want to see some big picture profiles or customization of the existing profile, especially things like tuning the sharpness, maybe the contrast and color in the normal profile on that one. But to be sure, this is becoming my drone of choice under $2,000. And let's face it, with DJI in the ring, that is not an easy battle to win. So props to Autel on that one. But hit me up with any questions you guys have. I'm also testing out some really new things on the drone front, so stay tuned. Tons of awesome stuff heading your way. Please hit notifications, subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you guys soon in a new video.